Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Jim Bowman. I'm an associate professor of English and the chair of the Division of Literature, Communication, Arts, and Gender Studies. And I'm happy to welcome you here tonight. We have a special guest who's going to be talking about a book that he has recently finished about President Zelensky of Ukraine. Before we get to his introduction, though, I want to thank the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences for supporting this event this evening. And to introduce our speaker, I'm going to start by introducing Alexei Ignatenko, Associate Professor of Chemistry, who helped to arrange this evening for us tonight. Thank you again for coming. Do you want to explain how the night will go, too, before you introduce him?
Right, sure. So there will be like 30 minutes talk and then 30 minutes left for questions. And so I should say that this event today was special for me, and I was hoping that it might be also special for many more people who are just upset with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we were hoping to have a good word for that, to have a relief. And our guest speaker is well known in Russia, Dmitry Bykov, poet, writer, scenarist. And you should know probably that in Russia they say a poet in Russia is a citizen. And if you know the literature, Russian literature, you probably know what I'm talking about, is that started like 200 years ago when Russian poet Nicolai Nekrasov wrote a poem titled Poet and Citizen. And then at that time, progressive forces were fighting tsarism in Russia. And then 150 years later, another Russian poet and writer and scenarist, Dmitry Bykov, created a series of recurring performances that were very well received in Russia, criticizing the government. And that upset the Kremlin. And guess what? Kremlin didn't like that. So they tried to poison Dmitry Bykov. But he survived, and he's here today, and he's fighting. And his most recent book about Zelensky biography, that is not just a biography, it's touching on more fundamental question that we are all facing for the future of our planet, and that is the fight between democratic forces and authoritarianism. Well, you know that right now there are a lot of points of conflict happening on a global scale in Ukraine, in Middle East, and between Koreas and in South China Sea. All of those are part of that global fight. And by the way, sliding democracies like in our country, it is also part of it. It's a global information war that is also happening. All right, so let's just welcome the speaker, Dmitry Bykov.
First of all, dear friends, that's my pleasure to see such a big amount of students who have nothing to do in such a bright evening. The weather is charming and you have come to listen about Zelensky. I always feel a kind of envy for the young people, and it's a pleasure to know they have enough time to listen about Ukrainian president. I'll try not to be very boring. I will read it, you know. As my compatriot Vladimir Nabokov used to say, I am a great thinker, a delicious writer, and a poor speaker. That's the reason I will read it aloud. It would be approximately half an hour, then you will have time to ask questions, try to think them off, to imitate your interest for the topic. Dear friends, my students know that I preface almost every lecture with the words, "We're about to have an exceptionally difficult conversation." Clearly, this is how I motivate them and even awaken a kind of excitement. But today we really do have a very difficult and complicated conversation to an exceptionally complex time. In the next 2 months, the whole world will be deciding for itself the main question: which view of humanity is to prevail? Either the worst perception of people will win, contempt for them, arrogant populism, the belief that the era of post-truth has arrived, that only force is right, that the time of tough men and spectacular decisions has come, or humanity is still aimed at cooperation, empathy, humanism, creative work, and peaceful development. Either it's time to allow ourselves the worst behavior, or we still need to heroically resist the beast, both within ourselves or in our close neighborhood. This applies to the Russian-Ukrainian war and the war between Israel and Hamas, and North Korea's war with the whole world, and America's upcoming domestic political problems, and the strategy of the Russian opposition, to which I successfully belong. During such an intense bifurcation, such global choices and turning points, making predictions and especially conclusions is a very weird business. But since Vladimir Zelensky is a fundamental non-systematic figure and interests me precisely in this capacity, we can resort to non-traditional, unconventional tools. We are talking about his prospects and plans from the point of view of the laws of composition, playwright, theater, and not political science and psychology. It's generally wonderful that the presence of an actor has produced and producer has once again made us to know that the main principle of the world order is life imitates art. This lecture is dedicated to an outstanding stand-up actor who became a great president, although his status is not final and may seriously change before our eyes. I am now publishing the English version of my book, VZ. This title is related to the fact that by someone inexplicable decision, the letters V and Z, which are Zelensky's initials, became the two main symbols of Russian aggression. For this book, which was published in Russian a year ago and was successful, including commercially, I now have to write the epilogue titled A Year Later. I have no idea what its ending will be. It's no wonder that Zelensky, to whom this book was delivered by Alexei Kiryushenko, the director of the Servant of People film, gave such a response. I was reading all the night through. It was interesting to see how it would end. We're also interested, otherwise he wouldn't have gathered there. There is a feeling that the fate of 20 centuries of Christian civilization, and perhaps all of humanity, is now at stake. It is from Zelensky now, and it was 3 years ago, that the answer to the question depends. What if all this history was in vain? All this struggle for humanistic values, the victory over fascism, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, David's victory over the giant Goliath, after all. What if not goodness wins, but brute force and bandit insolence? What if the people who share the worst perceptions of humanity and appeal to the worst instincts of their subjects are absolutely right? Naturally, at such a tense moment, and especially in a conversation about a stand-up comedian, we shouldn't be too serious. There is enough of that in the world already. Don't treat our conversation as a scientific lecture, and who am I after all? I've written 100 books, now 103, but, I even haven't got the degree of PhD. Zelensky, by the way, doesn't have one either, and it doesn't hinder him at all. Political correctness is not required from a stand-up performance. On the contrary, it should be shocking, provocative, and risky. This genre is characterized by direct contact with the audience. Sometimes I will ask you questions. You have the opportunity to ask them to me. Any form of contact is acceptable, except for throwing foreign objects from the audience. And I'm reading it only because I'm not a professional stand-up comedian after all, and don't rely too much on my memory. But unlike Nabokov, I read aloud quickly and expressively. Try to perceive all this to a stand-up performance and everything happening in the world today as another season of TV series, like Servant of the People, or The House of Cards, or The House of Servants. A long-awaited season, and perhaps the last one. Zelensky's past and the first stage of his presidency is really clear. It is not difficult to interpret his first years of presidency. The nation is tired of systematic or systemic politicians, who in Ukraine are formed either from old officials and young oligarchs. This nation is tired of corruption, false nationalism, as well as provincial national pride and intolerance. The country hopes for a fresh person who is connected to the oligarchy exclusively through work on TV and producing his own programs. The undeclared war with Russia, the conflict in Donbass imposed on the country, all his forces for siege for new perspectives. Zelensky witty, cynically, and mercilessly ridicules all Ukrainian politicians and himself intercepted. He becomes one of the most influential figures in the Ukrainian public space. His 40-hour pre-election video, Servant of the People, is an exceptionally professional satirical series recognized as a masterpiece in 1,000 countries. Zelensky was able to gain authority in society from scratch and mass serious capital. He is one of the highest paid actors and producers participating in Russian projects as well. He is a representative of the creative class, creative intelligentsia, which traditionally strongly influenced power in Ukraine, and a television magnate also. At the same time, he is relatively young, a loving family man, a good father, very witty by the way, and in addition to all this, he is a Jew. A Jew in power is a good PR for a young democracy. Anyone in America will confirm this to you. True, it's better to make him vice president, but there is no such position in Ukraine. A Jewish president is in an excellent starting position almost everywhere except perhaps Israel. Zelensky won with a good margin, about 70% against 25% at Petro Poroshenko. It was not as much his conquest as Petro Poroshenko's defeat. Indeed, one can't maintain a business in a country with which you are forced to fight, while repeating the slogan about one country, one army, and one fate. At the same time, Zelensky's first actions managed to show that he would not be able to maintain the rating, but the series has ended, or at least interrupted. Zelensky offered the country and the world a fundamentally new type of politician, a king narrator. Such a leader creates an exciting narrative for the nation about its goals and achievements, while professionals deal with the economy, building the army, and social protection of the population. It was precisely such a team of professionals that Zelensky tried to acquire, leaving for himself what he did perfectly well: ironic and motivating conversations with the nation, talented shows, and international contacts with the world leaders. Maybe that was the best intuitive choice for a young, problematic, and ambitious country. The first 2 years of Zelensky's presidency were not particularly successful. The rating fluctuated between 25 and 30%. The economy didn't fall but didn't grow either. The war in Donbass did not subside. Relations with Russia were not established. Although, of course, it was the aggressive Putin's Russia that was to blame for this. Ukraine's internal problems, social stratification, boundless corruption, ideological and religious divisions remained unsolved. Only Zelensky's creative group, Quartal 95, felt good, a team of satirists created by Zelensky personally, which delegated its leader to power, but still had many reasons for jokes. But then Russia, as always, with the grace of the beer in a China shop, helped Ukraine to solve its internal problems with external aggression. Zelensky tried until the last moment not so much to ignore the danger, but not to fully believe in it. Kamala Harris recently recalled how a week before the Russian aggression, she told him the exact date of the offensive and the number of attacking forces, as well as the main directions of the attack. Zelensky knew all this, but didn't want to spread panic, and therefore his speeches until the very war remained more reassuring than alarmist. Today, there are many who want to expose Zelensky's behavior in the first days of the war. According to Petro Poroshenko's version, he immediately left Kiev, while Poroshenko himself bravely organized armed units. There is also a version that Zelensky was personally prevented from flying away by Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny. But the fact remains, Zelensky did not fly away. By the way, in the first days of the war, young journalist Dmitry Komarov, who is my good friend, was almost constantly with him. He repeatedly and personally captured Zelensky on Bankovая Street, filmed his briefings at that very bunker. Zelensky has always been able to take care of creating a narrative. And there is no doubt that it was he who, on the third day of the war, in a conversation with the British Prime Minister in response to the offer of evacuation, said the famous phrase, "I need ammunition, not a taxi." This phrase is already in history, just like the famous appeal, "Ask not how your country can do for you," or Lincoln's famous assessment, "The little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War," or the equally famous phrase of the astronaut, "One small step for man and giant leap for mankind." The ability to express oneself aphoristically is a serious gift for a stand-up comedian and a politician, which also unites them. Zelensky generally reacted to what was happening with his signature black humor, which gave Ukrainian reason to call him our little Churchill in T-shirt. One can evaluate Zelensky's categorical decision to cease all negotiations with Russia in early April 2022, that is after Bucha, in different ways. Some now say that Boris Johnson demanded the Istanbul negotiations be stopped. At the time, many saw that the sight of Kiev's devastated suburbs, previously the most prosperous and wealthy areas of Ukraine, shocked Zelensky. At the sight of executed civilians, he forever lost his humor and lightness. He seemed as if dusted with ashes. After Bucha, and especially after Mariupol, he repeatedly stated that there was nothing to negotiate about and no reason to negotiate with such an aggressor. It was clear that the treaties would redeem this evil, and no territorial or political concessions would stop it. It became evident that Vladimir Putin had the task to destroy Ukraine at any cost, and selling this to his subjects as the greatest geopolitical victory. Zelensky began to be perceived in the world as the one force capable of opposing the Russian dictatorship. Moreover, a certain symmetry of these two Vladimirs, two captains, the KGB captain and the captain of the student KVN team, became evident. This is the start of the mysterious or mystical part of our history. Vladimir Putin also came to power thanks to a TV series. However, he did not act in it. It was a series about a spy, the most popular spectacle in Soviet history, the source of many sequels, imitations, and anecdotes. The TV movie 70 Moments of Spring established this figure of the spy as the ideal and idol. This spy was invented by the writer and historian Yulian Semyonov, who was directly involved in the publication of Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita in the magazine Moscow, where Semyonov worked at this time. Stirlitz, whom Vladimir Putin largely imitates, also knows German perfectly, as befits Mephistopheles. Walland has a triple function. All three functions are inherited in Vladimir Putin's image. Firstly, he is an executioner, secondly, a spy of the Lord, and thirdly, the patron of arts and sciences. And the contract for work is in his hands, in the hands of devil. He is the benefactor of masters, and therefore the masters of all arts in Russia overwhelmingly support Putin and his war. These perfectly understand that without the war, there will be no Putin's power, and the sick artificial system that generates all Russian phenomenon will collapse. Military science, space, state-funded theater, imperial patriotic literature, and surely famous Russian ballet. Nowhere in the world is the state the absolute imperial the absolute master of everything. Culture, science, all the bowels of the earth, the property and life of its subjects. The power of the state is in Russia not limited by any institutions, neither courts, nor elections, nor competition, and this system is extremely convenient for everyone who fears the competition and concurrence. In Russia, it's not difficult to build a good career. I could even manage it. It's enough to support the authorities approving any of those actions. Vladimir Putin himself is a faceless person, an ideal executioner. Zelensky is also a performer. Speaking in Russian, you know, there are two words for execution and performer. The same word исполнитель. They both are performers. But surely in Russian, execution is much more popular. Sadomasochism is generally an interesting and attractive thing. Tickets for the show are always well sold. Tortures, questioning, arrests is the best spectacle in Russia. This is all very interesting, but the Faustian novel in 1944 had a predictable outcome because there was a Soviet power. The Soviet Union was maybe the only force which could stop Hitler. There is no Soviet Union now anywhere in the world. And even the United States, despite its similarity to the late stage of the Soviet Empire, doesn't pay as much attention to ideology. Sadly, we have to admit that Russia can't be defeated. At least it has not been possible so far. Vladimir Putin has posed a serious choice for the whole world. Either they give him the entire Eastern Hemisphere, and eventually the Western one, if he has enough time, or he blows up the whole world and himself along with it, which will look like a deserved draw for his country. Vladimir Putin is sincerely convinced that the West values human lives and financial well-being too highly, and therefore it's not ready to confront Russia when human life is worthless. David convincingly stands up to Goliath, who has no nuclear weapons, and when he does, the sling is not of much value, even if it is accompanied by NATO instructors how to use the sling. Vladimir Zelensky needs to ensure the victory of good. He agreed to the lead role on the moral condition, and of course Russia itself is doing everything possible for the victory of good, making irrational decisions, arresting or expelling all its intellectual, breaking of international ties, and remaining in complete isolation. except the North Korea, who loves Vladimir Putin, and Mongolia, who is afraid to arrest him. Vladimir Putin is absolutely lonesome. He knows very well the value of loyal friendship with third-rate dictatorial regimes since Soviet times. After all, he himself has built such a regime, very pale both intellectually and aesthetically. Vladimir Zelensky has made many mistakes in 3 years of the war. I think they were inevitable. The laws of art are stronger than political logic, and when you are dealing with a king narrator, it's useful to remember that. First, the military becomes more popular and important than the politicians during the war. Competition between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, the two VZs, was absolutely inevitable. Zelensky did not play Napoleon in Russian comedy for nothing, and was extremely convincing in this role. The famous phrase of Napoleon, addressed to General Augereau, "You are a head taller than me, but it's easy to fix," would be quite organic in the mouth of Zelensky. The laws of art are higher than pragmatics, and the conflict between the commander-in-chief and the high commander was inevitable also. Zaluzhny behaved with exceptional tact. Zelensky also does not interfere with him to express his opinions, assessments of the situation, and even give advices to the country leadership. Zelensky failed to defeat corruption, but corruption, to be honest, is the flip side of Ukrainian freedom, independence, and the lack of a centralized dictatorship. However, Russia also has amazing corruption, and therefore is not capable of full mobilization. Perhaps only corruption is holding the world back from total Russian dictatorship and Ukraine from totalitarianism. Zelensky said in a speech at Berkeley that even if he turns into a totalitarian dragon, Ukrainian society will quickly clip his wings. This is fair, but the society is unable to stop stealing. If this is the source of its existence and strength, let it be. Zelensky failed to organize a counteroffensive last summer, but in August of this year, it was his initiative, which everyone attributes to themselves personally, that Ukraine captured a third of the Kursk region in Russia. That was a typical move of a king narrator. Militarily, it was meaningless, since no one doubts Russia's ability to push the Ukrainians out of its territory. But as a PR move, it's absolutely brilliant. The lack of motivation among Russian military and civilians, the presence of huge holes in Russian defense, and most importantly, the readiness of the Russian population to submit to any conqueror, not the most humiliating collaboration. This was the move, not of a commander, but of a showman, and Ukraine highly appreciated the initiative of its commander. No one can speak with certainty about the scenario for the further development of the war. It depends on the results of US elections and the mood of European politicians, among whom there are enough hidden Putinists. Zelensky's rating, which soared in the beginning of the war to predictable 90 after repeated falls and rises, is depending on the situation, but now around 60. Many believe in the inevitability of the second presidential term, which he himself repeatedly refused at the beginning of his career. Holding elections during the war is prevented not only by the constitution of Ukraine, but also by the continuous missile strikes of Ukrainian cities. A breakthrough in the war is possible in the winter, when Ukraine receives another military aid from the West, and serious economic and social upheavals occur to Russia, which the statesmen of the participants in the war are increasingly hinting at. In Russia, there is far from a monolithic enthusiasm around the figure of Putin, and from the point of view of Russian propaganda, it's a factor of national consensus. But even someone who has long watched nothing but stand-up series cannot believe Russian propaganda. For me, of course, the ideal development of the situation would be what is predicted in my book. Zelensky leaves after 5 years of the presidency, goes to the United States, plays the lead role in his biopic Zelensky, and returns to his homeland with an Oscar. So far, this forecast is unlikely. Zelensky can't leave, the war can't end, and in the war of attrition, Russia has the predominant chances due to its huge monetary and mineral resources. Add to this the endless patience of the elderly population of Russia and the aggression of the young ones. I sincerely believe that Ukraine will be torn apart by the 4th years of the war and will hate Zelensky, who continues to refuse negotiations. I also admit that Zelensky will be forced to go to the negotiations and even, at least desirable situation, persuade Putin to agree to them. I admit that the American authorities will stop supporting Ukraine, getting distracted by trying to make America great again. I submit a scenario in which Zelensky will have to send his family out of the country. I absolutely do not admit his flight, because an actor is the last person in the modern world who really cares how he looks. I insist only that in any situation we should be grateful to Zelensky for defending the honor and freedom of Ukraine, for overturning stereotypes about the inability of creative workers to govern the state. That in a categorically non-systemic situation, this fundamentally non-systemic politician behaved with unpredictable courage and defended our common honor. I perfectly understand that Ukraine is defending me personally, including from cowardice and conformism. Zelensky's example is before my eyes, and I have no right for weakness, complaints, or retreats. Sometimes someone needs to remind the world of the existence of high virtues, that behavior can be beautiful and ugly, that freedom is more favorable than dictatorship, not only in the economic sphere, but also in the moral one. Although many consider this concept outdated, I perfectly understand that the Ukrainian struggle with monuments and the Russian language does not add either monolithism or charm in the country, but I also understand that Russia has destroyed its place in world culture and compromised the 7 most recent centuries of its development. Ukraine seems to me today a more promising center of attraction and unification of Europe. Whatever the fate of Zelensky is, let's be grateful for him, for the fact that thanks to him, we have often experienced joy and pride in the last 3 years. I hope he will be grateful for me for those words, whatever deeds I may commit in the future. After all, I also am an artist and never know what to accept from myself. Thank you for patience. If you have some questions, I'm ready to answer. Why is Zelensky Jewish identity important within Ukraine? It's all important within Russia. How? You know that anti-Semitism is the good tradition of Russia. Surely the good only for being most vivid and evident. You know, anti-Semitism in Russia still grows under the periods of dictatorship. It's also important for Ukraine because Ukraine wants to prove its tolerance. You know that Ukraine has a heavy guilt for Ukrainian Jews during the Second World War. Some of Ukrainians participated in the destroying of Jewish homes and killing Jews in Babi Yar. So this is the act of justification and rehabilitation, the proof of tolerance and progress. By the way, Jew in the world is always the agent of progress, of unstable times. I must say that Jew always provokes others, and maybe Jew is the only agent of future. Maybe God's decision for the world is to provoke it by Jewish question. So Zelensky is also the subject maybe of split in Ukrainian society. He never unites. But even as you remember, even Christ said, I bring you the split, the sword, not the peace. Zelensky is the agent of progress, and by the way, he is self-ironic, like most Jews in the history and art. I must say that being Jew, he knows very well what is bullying. he understands very well how heavy it is to stand alone against the crowd, the whistling and screaming crowd. He had such experience at school because you know that he was growing up in the very traditional Ukrainian city in Kryvyi Rog, where, as he said, being Jew is an interesting challenge. But he was very popular at his school. He manages somehow to be in peace with everyone. Maybe his being Jew is also a good challenge for Russia, because for Russia, a Jew in neighborhood is always a big problem. I know that Putin personally was not anti-Semitic just in the beginning of his career, but now he jokes very often about Israel, about the Jews. He repeats some very weird jokes. He hates not Jews, but he hates Jewish independence and surely Jewish money. That's the reason that being a Jew for Zelensky is maybe the best way to stand against Russian traditional xenophobia. How do you maintain the courage to speak against Putin and the Russian government? You see, I have no courage. That's not my decision. I'm a typical conformist, and if it depended on me, maybe I would be on their side. Being very conservative, very traditional, but first I'm also a Jew, which is very flattering, and that's the reason they will never adopt me. The second reason is that maybe I'm too smart for them. I'm not very smart, but too smart for them. So it's enough. My wit is enough. Then, it is such a humiliation to be on their side. They are so foolish. Their narration is so primitive. By the way, Boris Pasternak, also the hero of one of my books, my big biography, I have written a big book about him, and sometimes I think he posthumously supports me. So Boris Pasternak said once to one of his friends, the famous literary critic, all the Soviet propaganda is so foolish. Why wouldn't they call us? We'll do the same but much better. This critic gave him a very witty answer. He said, they need no smart propaganda. They want to show us that they don't consider us to be human beings. We will add everything and thank them. We don't deserve the smart propaganda. And that's the reason they don't need me as a smart propagandist. But America needs, and that's the reason I'm teaching here. The August move to impact war from a PR move from much is dependent on audiences in Russia getting access to information that may be censored. You see, that's an illusion that there are some problems with information in Russia. You're absolutely free to get everything from the net. You can't stop the net. Maybe Alexander Yakovlev, one of the main reformers of Russia and the architect of the so-called perestroika, was absolutely right. Internet is the last stage of freedom. You can't destroy it. Having some methods, some skills to avoid censorship, you can get all the information. The problem is that in Russia nobody wants to know the facts. Everybody is happy to live in a kind of comfortable dream, to watch comfortable dreams. And by the way, I would also ask you a question. How do you think, what is the main aim of Philistine, of the so-called ordinary people? I believe that nobody is ordinary, but let's think that there are some. What is the main aim of normal human being? Of you, for example, or me? What do we want most of all? Don't propose the food, because food is maybe too primitive. What is the meaning? Yeah.
The Russian modern philosopher said, Michael Deller said that the goal for every human being is to cause the most impact.
Yeah, Michael Deller is a good friend of mine. That's the reason I was listening for this theory daily for 5 years, where he was my neighbor. I must say that the main aim of any human being is the overestimation of self, is the good attitude towards ourselves. we like to like ourselves. We try to deny all the facts which somehow destroy our self-adoration. And that's the reason most of Russians don't want to know the facts. Neither do we. I'm absolutely sure that most of you are not interested in Ukrainian situation. I can explain why. It's not very flattering for us. Ukrainian fighting, Ukrainian citizenship, Ukraine as a whole is opposing the great danger, and we want to respect ourselves. We want to say that this danger is not so huge, and maybe if we agree with Putin, he will leave us alone. No, he won't. You know that Putin's hatred for Ukraine is like a bicycle. If it doesn't go further, it falls down. Putin wants to get Ukraine as a whole. Then he will get all Western Europe. Then he is looking about Eastern Europe. Then maybe he is looking about the United States. He will never be stopped by any circumstances. The only hope is for his natural death, but modern medics are well aware of their profession. So he can survive everything. Maybe he will destroy himself and his country before he takes the world. That's the only hope. Most of you, and maybe sometimes even me, we don't want the truth about Ukrainian war. We can't become knowing about all this. When we are aware, when we are informed of the situation, we can't sleep well. And that's the main problem. I like Zelensky, and I can say I like him, he's not a girl, but nevertheless, I love Zelensky because he reminds me about bravery. More than this, about non-conformism. He is ready to die, and that's heroism. He is ready to die either to agree, and that's great. So I must say that most of the world inhabitants nowadays prefer not to know, prefer to sleep well. I hope that something will change very soon. Have you been able to witness Zelensky's famous speech in person, and also what made you so intrigued of this topic specifically? Well, you know, the future is the only problem which is interesting for me. I know everything about the past, I know most facts about the present, but the future is absolutely mysterious. I can't tell you what intrigued me and how I looked at him. Yuri Guzman, who is one of the main Soviet Russian performers, here is my son who comes here. That's my interest for the future. I'll let him in just a minute. You will see charming kid. Иди сюда. Не заходи. Все хотят посмотреть глаза. Yes, here. That's my goal for the future. He's also a good friend of Zelensky. He saw him in Kiev. You see, Guzman tried to show me to Zelensky in 2011. He said, this guy is very talented. I don't know whom he meant, me or Zelensky. I remember very well how I was interviewing Zelensky, being the president. He recognized me, which is very flattering. I was interviewing him in the end of August of 2021, just before the war. And they asked him in this interview, would you as an actor play Putin? He said, I don't take episodes for a long time. He was absolutely right. Putin is episode, is a small role. I'm interested in Zelensky because he looks for quick and witty answers practically immediately. He can improvise it. You know that even myself, who is also a good improvisator, is reading the lecture. I can answer your questions immediately, but I have to write the lecture before reading it. Zelensky improvises absolutely calmly without any problems. And he is so witty, you can answer everything, and his answer is always unpredictable. That's the reason I'm interested in him. You know, all my life I was trying to prove that the representative of creative intelligence can rule everything. The newspaper, the agency, the broadcast, And everybody told me, only managers can rule by the process. You are just an executioner and sometimes the bright performer. I can be a good leader of the country, I'm absolutely sure. And now I can give the link of Zelensky's presidency. I can give this example. This is very consoling because I see some political future for me. I must be my personal avenger. What is the position of Russian government about the reports of civilian deaths and war crimes carried on by its troops in Ukraine? You see, the position is very simple. Most of Russian officials are quite sure that the best lot for these people, the best lot for Russian inhabitants, is to die for motherland. Putin told many times, what is the best way? To die being drunk in the crash, in the accident, or maybe to die of some disease? No, the best way is to die for motherland as a warrior. He has no ways for life. He believes only in death. I can understand him. He is 73, he is not very healthy, and maybe the idea of heroic death is the only consoling idea of his age. I can understand because I'm 56, and when I see the young people, I sincerely hate them. That's absolutely explainable. I think about heroic death as the best way for them. You touched on Israel violence against Hamas. How is it similar to the one in Ukraine? How is it different? The main difference is, I will try to explain. That's a very complicated problem, but Israel and Ukraine has no way out. They deserve their life. There is no way to, for example, to ask for mercy. There is no mercy. Just like for the Jews during the Second World War. For fascists, a Jew is the main enemy. You should be destroyed. You can't survive. That's the problem. No way out. As Ukrainians, for example, Ukrainians try to survive in the surrounding of enemies. And that's the problem. They have no way out. They can't give up. There is no possibility to give up, to say, now let's stop it, we'll do everything you want. No, they want us to die. As, for example, Volodymyr said once, there can be no compromise with us and our enemies. They want to kill us and we want to survive. There is not a big space of compromise. I must say that there is some similarity between Ukraine and Israel because the country is united. And now we see maybe the forming of the new and great nation. I hate the situation when peaceful and ordinary human beings should die in the war. I am absolutely sure that peaceful people shouldn't die. But we all remember how it began. Sometimes I am repeating my phrase, which costed me a good portion of reputation, that creation of Israel at this time and this place was a historical mistake. But if this historical mistake is fulfilled, is done, now you should defend your family. It is nowhere to go. They have no abilities to replay this game. And so I understand that for Ukrainians, it's also no place for retirement. There is no discharge in the war. Who said? Kipling, if you remember. There is no discharge in the war. Maybe the tragedy of Ukraine is that Russia can't be replaced from its historical place. And all the Russians never can immigrate. What are the viewpoints of individuals who support Russia's action against Ukraine? They're very evident, very simple. You know that there is always, maybe the main conflict in Russian literature, the very ancient, the very classic conflict is between the truth and the motherland. If motherland says, you should fulfill any order. So, as for me, there can be no conflict between motherland and the truth. Because if motherland is wrong, you should speak on this. But in Russia, in Russian ideology, the motherland is higher than everything. Like German in German fascism. The whole of motherland takes off all the moral bans, all the moral restrictions. As Hitler said, I can get rid of the chimera of conscience. I can kill your conscience. I take your sins for myself. And that's very typical for any dictatorship regimes. Have you been back to Russia? If not, do you feel scared to go back? Well, I went away from Russia in the very beginning of the war and even before the war, because I have got a proposition from Kremlin to become writer in residence. I worked there for 2 years, then came to Rochester to work at the university. And so I have all possibilities to be back to Russia, to be arrested in Russia, to be killed in Russia. There were some attempts to kill me. There was such an attempt for assassination, which is proved. I survived, thanks to the doctors that cured Navalny. After it, Navalny was also a good friend of mine. I was a good friend of Navalny, to be exact. So the time passed, and all the documents are published. I know they wanted to kill me. It is also pleasant, because I want to be dangerous for them. I don't want to be arrested now, but I surely will be back to Russia when Putin regime is destroyed by himself. There are no revolutionaries who will destroy it. It will destroy himself because it's suicidal. All the suicide attempts were done. This regime destroys himself very quickly. You can be sure that the 30s will start without Putin. I trust, I can believe that maybe there would be a civil war for 2 or 3 years. And only after it, there will be a normal way. But surely Putin's regime won't live for long. It's suicidal, and more than this, it's very foolish. You know that I don't like some American conservatives, but nevertheless they are smart. Putin is not. Was it Zelensky's recent idea to get nuclear weapons or his advice? I don't know. I know also that this is a typical move of the king narrator. He wants to fight, and he is able to fight. And Putin is absolutely sure that Ukraine can create nuclear weapons. You know that Ukraine had it for a long time. And then it gave it for the guarantees of Budapest treaty. Ukraine can get nuclear weapons very quick, much quicker than Iran. I am sure they won't do this, because the war, I hope, will be stopped next year. What do you say to someone who says you can't achieve great power in ethical ways? What does Putin wish to achieve with all this power he plans to acquire? You see, as a religious person, I'm very happy to know that your university is somehow Catholic. I'm God believer, which is also very traditional and conservative. I don't hide this fact, because otherwise maybe if God didn't help me many times, I wouldn't survive my Russian years. I know it very exactly. Russia is the good school of religion, because it's governed only by God. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist anymore. I know that Russia is ruled by some irrational forces, and that's the reason I deeply believe that God exists and helps. So ethical ways are alternatively, and maybe the only way to save your life and to create your biography is an ethical way. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of the greatest Russian businessmen and oppositioners, told me once, he gave me a good advice. He said, if you have no profitable way to act, try to be ethical. First of all, try to be profitable, but then try to be ethical. I must say that maybe ethical behavior is the most suitable, profitable, simple, and guaranteed. I know that, for example, lie is very difficult. I know also that crime destroys you physically, as Dostoevsky proved in his most famous novel. There is no ethical reason to behave well with the old woman. But if you kill the old woman, it destroys you physically. Maybe there is a good formula by Mark Aurelius, who said, "Soul is Christian by nature." That's the reason I'm ethical. It was mentioned that you had some interaction with the Russian government and they didn't like you. What was this time like for you? I was flattered also, because if fool doesn't like you, it somehow proves that you are not so foolish. Good attitude from tyrann, it is flattering sometimes, it's pleasant, but only in the first moment. I understand very well that I could build a great career in Russia, being a propagandist for Putin. And I voted for Putin at the beginning of his career because the alternatives were much worse, like Lushkov, for example, Primakov. But now I understand very well, they never adopt me, and that's the reason that sometimes I have the reason for self-respect. If you want to respect yourselves, try to be moral. That's all I want to tell you, be much elder than you are. Thank you for patience. Bye.